Welcome to the first episode of the Two Heads podcast with me, Lorna Hackett, and Michael Mansfield QC. Now, this first episode is divided into two parts, and it's called the Global Citizen Paradox, where we discuss what does it mean to be a citizen in 2022? How do we reduce inequalities and discrimination? And what does making a real difference mean if you're just one person? We really hope you enjoy the show. Hello, everyone. My name's Lorna Hackett. I'm Head of Legal Practice at Hackett and Dabbs LLP. I'm a barrister and I'm very happy to be here with
Michael Mansfield, who is also a barrister and has been for rather a long time, not quite prehistoric, but nearly. So I've been in practice for 50 years and I've been to a lot of different places, a lot of different cases, which people may have read about or not, but I suppose the ones that come to mind relate to miscarriages of justice in the 1980s, the Lawrence inquiry, and since then, I'm currently involved in the Grenfell inquiry.
Perhaps we should explain why we're here.
Well, I think it's people seem to remember, but again, I have to remember my age, and I don't want to sound like John Cleese and a shoebox, but there was a series called Face to Face that I used to watch a long time ago, where two armchairs were facing each other, containing two people, who then, it was an interview situation in which people were interviewed in depth in a way that doesn't happen anymore. So it started with that, and also the fact that we did a symposium for Cambridge University, and it was a conversation, really. And I think the idea was to try and conversationalize and also make information accessible and make concepts accessible to everybody rather than it being locked away. And I think from my point of view, particularly, there's too much media culture, which is soundbite. In other words, you can't say it in two sentences, it's not worth saying. And so what happens is you get a very superficial analysis of everything. And I think it's unfair. People are much more sensible than that.
Yes. News nowadays appears to be a veneer, and what we want to do is try to think more, in depth about.
And I think people have been, over the pandemic particularly, which we're still in, people have become isolated. That was already happening through Silicon Valley. People were getting locked into a screen. I mean, I have an obsession with screen culture. I don't like the fact that everything, mobile phones, televisions, everything is through a screen. You even have people sitting next to each other on the tube, talking to each other through their mobile phones. I mean, this is the ultimate for me. Can't believe it. And actually, I saw it the other day, an interview with somebody. It's called twitching. Do you know about twitching?
I think I've heard of twitching.
Twitching, in which you actually allow yourself to be out there on the information highway and the superhighway, that people can watch you watching a game. Gaming. And this particular woman had not been outside for years. She can't face people in person anymore. And she was saying, I'm going to have to curb the number of hours I spend in front of the screen. Now, I said all that because actually I feel that, the screen has been coming between people, and during COVID, still going on, as I say, I think there is an isolation that creeps in, serious isolation, mental isolation, and you wonder when you're coming out the other end. And when you do come out the other end, things are a little different. And of course, remote working and so on. I don't know whether you felt the same kind of isolation.
Well, certainly, and I know there haven't been, increasingly there are now, but in terms of big events, and you watch people in crowds, and are they really enjoying what's happening, or are they just looking at what's happening in person through their mobile phone? Because everybody's recording it now. So is that enjoying the moment, or is it actually just recording for future reference or to be able to show their friends?
Well, I don't know the answer to that, but probably, because I don't do that, so I don't know. And I've been lucky enough to have good cameras over the years, and the idea that you see something, I've given up taking photographs. even on the mobile phone. Because I'm thinking, no, the moment is here now. I don't want to spend my time looking at you through a camera to sort of, in a way, concretize it on a bit of plastic. Well, not anymore, but digitally in my phone. So, and I think there is this ongoing. I think it's a sort of an environment in which people are feeling, in a sense, not only cut off but disempowered, because they're at home and isolated. And we're living, I remember as a book, we've talked about this, I know, once before, but this dates me, I'm afraid, again. But Marshall McLuhan wrote a series of books some long time ago, and he coined the phrase the global village. This is in the 1970s, the global village. And this is when computers were sort of coming in. And he thought that this was a problem, and he was right. Because, of course, there was going to be a situation in which we connected throughout. There's a great joy in connecting throughout the world, but the connection is done from an isolated position. So then you feel you have a sense of power in as much as I can reach out to you wherever you are. But at the same time, that enables governments, it enables authorities to keep a beady eye on what you're up to. And so this relationship between the individual and authority and the state is being eroded by the very thing that everybody's desperate to have, which is, their bit of hardware which allows them to connect, which is great, but it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah, so in some ways we are more connected than we've ever been, but we are also more isolated than we've ever been. And I suppose while there's so much polarity and so much discourse about our differences, our similarities as human beings far outweigh our differences, don't they?
Well, I think, yes, the similarities do. And I think it's being able to perceive the similarities, to be compassionate about the similarities. And I think, the whole environmental movement, which is extremely important, especially amongst the younger generation, because they're connecting with each other and they're connecting with, the planet where we live. And I think it was interesting, well, I thought it was interesting anyway, is that I've always favored, getting out on the street. And if you've got a point you want to make, making it so that others can hear and see you make it, which is why I'm worried about all the protest legislation that's going on at the moment. You want people out there so you get the message and you have a collectivity and you feel a solidarity, all words that are going a bit out of vogue really, but I think they're important for the future because they empower people. People feel that they can make a difference. And the thing that happened during COP26 was not what went on inside the halls of power, as it were, because they didn't match up with the real needs of restricting global warming and all the rest of it. Whereas the young ones out on the street, and a lot of other ones as well, were saying, come on, you've got to get on with it now, not 20 years down the road. It's got to happen now. There are countries in the world like Bangladesh which are sinking underwater as we speak. So I think that, one and the same time, the connection is important because you can now see almost instantly what's happening in another part of the world. But then you've got to translate that into some kind of action. Yeah, so I think the problem we're trying to sort of think through is an age in which we've got the global village and we're dealing with the villagers, people, on the street who I have a sort of vision always. Maybe because of Grenfell, it may not be, it may be for other reasons. The constraints for the vast bulk of people where they're living in conditions which are sometimes getting worse because the pandemic has discriminated in a way because those throughout the whole world who are in an impoverished situation, either nationally because they don't have the resources. And in some cases, there's, I cite Bangladesh because there's a report recently on it, where there's no they're living in conditions with no running water, no clean water, no electricity, and they're living on tiny shreds of land that are left. And then, that's a situation that's replicated throughout the world. It may be different situations. It may be a block of flats in which people are worrying about where the food's going to come from tomorrow. So in that situation, that global village has been created. So we all know what the problems are, as they did in COP26, is how are you going to provide for those people, providing economically for those bulk of the world. They want to make a contribution, but they can't because they're so constrained by daily life that's the difficulty. So, I don't know.
Yeah, well, exactly. So how do you get past immediate need? And I suppose alongside that, immediate fear, which is crippling, isn't it?
Well, I think, yes, it is crippling. And somebody listening might say, well, it's all very well, you sitting in an armchair talking about all this. The fact is, what am I going to do? And what I try to do in all the various situations where, as a lawyer, I've come across that situation so many times, but so many times I've learnt the lesson from other people who've said, that's how we started off. We thought as an individual that we wouldn't make a difference. And the examples that come to mind straight away is sort of the Birmingham Six, locked up for so long, but actually fought. The Bloody Sunday families who fought to get an inquiry. And on it goes, Lawrence's and the Hillsborough families and now the Grenfell family. And they all have one thing in common. Main thing being, we want the truth to be told, first of all. Secondly, we want accountability. And, we want governments to respond and connect and bring forth some kind of justice. And so I think that's what we've been trying to translate. In other words, we want that to happen and we want to try and facilitate that. So so the examples I give is that even though people may have been locked up for a long time, physically or mentally, at the end of the day, everyone has an ability, if they can find where it is in themselves, to actually come out and do something. And once they stand together, then things do happen in that way. Yeah, so I think what you can extrapolate from all of this is that, one, the citizen has a role, and whoever you are, however you feel impoverished or disempowered, you're not actually. You can make a difference. Not necessarily on your own. It requires you connecting with other people who are in a similar position, who join together, and then you provide one voice. It's not going to happen overnight. You have to persist, you have to have patience, you have to have stamina, and you have to have courage. All those things. That's asking a lot of people who may have already been victims and been through hell to get to where they are. But what has happened in each of these cases is they have succeeded in getting the authorities and society as a whole to re-examine what happened, let's say on Bloody Sunday, that the people who were shot dead weren't terrorists at all. So that's just one example. In Lawrence's case, that their young son who was murdered was a result of a racist attack. And of course, that was re-examining all sorts of assumptions. So they've worked hard on behalf of the community as a whole to make a difference. And I think one of the main examples I wanted to bring up is truth and reconciliation as a concept. And that arises in the context of Bloody Sunday, but also in the context of South Africa, because Archie, as he was called, Archbishop Tutu, died very recently, and I had the privilege at one time when I was in South Africa doing a tribunal. I got to meet him, and I think he's a remarkable individual for empowering people with their own spirituality.
I'd just like to take a moment now to mention our amazing sponsors, Clio. As I'm the head of legal practice at a law firm, I'm always looking for ways to become more efficient, to save time on administrative tasks, and to keep track of client contact and matter management. And I have to say, Clio allows me to do all of this and so much more. At Hackett and Dabs, we've been using Clio for about the last 18 months and it has been absolutely brilliant. Importantly, it allows me to free up my valuable time to devote more to my clients and to the matters that I am so passionate about, like social justice. Clio offers really great customer service, flexible contracts, and a free trial so you can try out their software before you buy. There are also really nice people who are totally committed to achieving access to justice for all in society, including the most vulnerable. In short, I would recommend Clio to any lawyer or law firm. To see for yourself why I'm so pleased with them, visit www.clio.com/UK/2heads. That's www.clio.com/UK/2heads. And now, back to the show. So what, for anybody that doesn't know, what is a Truth and Reconciliation Tribunal?
Well, it's remarkable how many of these there have been, because people don't really know them. But over the last 50 years, there have been 50 different countries who've decided to employ, one way or another. They can be governmental funded, or they can be non-governmental funded, so the community do it. The object being to bring about an inquiry into the truth of something that's happened or is still happening. So it can be either historic or current. So people want to know, so what went wrong, for example, in a particular set of circumstances, and who was responsible. And once they establish that part of it, the next part of it is obviously accountability in relation to that. Now, there are different ways of bringing about accountability. You can have, what you and I know as criminal cases and prosecutions and all that. Or if you have a different kind of vision and a different kind of justice, you say, this is the difficult bit. You say, well, once we've established the truth of what happened and who did it, the next question is, what are you going to do about the people who did it? So one version is to say, well, provided they admit it, that's a big proviso, they have to admit it, then they have to, as it were, admit it publicly, and you bring the two sides, if you like, the perpetrator and those who've been the victim of the perpetrator, together in a room just like this, sitting as close as this. Big step for the perpetrator. One thing to admit it and run away, that's difficult enough, but to actually come face to face, as we are, with somebody who has caused your family and your loved ones mutilation, death in terrible circumstances, the sort of thing, think the worst, and it's happened to your family. And so the pressure's on the perpetrator not to, as it were, betray, if you like, the class, the government and all the rest of it by admitting anything, on the one hand. And on the other hand, for the person who is the victim, there would be all their friends saying, you can't allow this to happen, he's getting away with it, or she, whoever it is. So it presents an enormously difficult moral question. But when it happens, and it did in South Africa, extremely under the tutelage of Archbishop Tutu, he did bring the two sides together, and there's a wonderful film which I saw in Ireland while I was doing the Bloody Sunday inquiry, and I expect you know The Hard Day's Journey. Well, this is A Hard Night's Journey into Day. So they reversed the title in order to show people that you live in the dark, you've been in the dark, apartheid, so on, but they came into the light with this process of truth and reconciliation. Now, it doesn't fit everywhere, but I think it's intended to not only get to the truth, but overcome division. And at the moment, you've got a division, huge division in the United States. You've got a division in the United Kingdom. It's getting bigger as a chasm growing between those who care and those who don't, those who have and those who don't. It's almost as simple as that.
I suppose on a very small level, domestically, I've worked with people who have been involved in restorative justice in prison. So represented people in prison who have met with their victims' families. And then so very similar to this, table in between them to talk about the crime, to admit it, to explain why. And that, on a very small level, is very powerful, just with those two parties. And of course, it enables the offender to look their victims in the eye and say, I'm sorry. And that, yes, this is a person who's in prison, but it's still very powerful, because then, while there may never be full understanding, there will always be regret. It enables people to have at least some knowledge of what was going on in the situation. And of course, from that can come compassion on both sides.
Well, yes, and I think, I know you said it before, and you're right, that compassion is what is missing. What is missing at the moment was missing in government during the pandemic, especially at the beginning. And it's all very well for certain people to now stand up and say, oh, I'm very sorry for what I did, or that what's been missing throughout has been that element. And there's a scene in the film, there's more than one film actually, because what they did, they filmed the commission as a whole, which lasted 3 or 4 years. There's a particular scene, it stuck in my memory, and I can see it now as I begin to think about it. A woman had lost her son, well, he'd been killed, by the security forces in South Africa during the time of apartheid. So they found the perpetrator who'd admitted it. They found the mother. And then comes the moment when they meet for the first time. So what they did is they put the mother outside one side of an area which was being filmed with a camera. And they got permission from both that they were going to film it. And they got the member of the security services on the other one. So the room was empty. And then they walked away and said, it's over to you now, take your time. And you're thinking, oh my, what's going to happen here? First you're in the shoes of the mother, then you're in the shoes of the soldier, essentially, that's what he was. And what was interesting was, you could see them, because they were filmed before they opened the door to go into the room where they knew they were going to meet the other person. So this was the moment, l'instant de vérité, as they say in French, the moment of truth. And then they filmed from inside, and you saw the door slowly opening, and you could see somebody, and of course they had their supporters on their side trying to persuade the person not to do this. And then you saw them walk towards each other. And you thought, what are they thinking about each other? And of course, all the supporters had to be out of it. They didn't come into the room. So it's the room just with the two. And I thought it was simply heartbreaking, but a spiritual moment in which I found it was truly uplifting, because they got right up to each other. They clearly weren't quite sure what they should do, but then they did it. They didn't say anything, just put their arms around each other. And they stayed like that. And you could see they couldn't really let go, because this was a moment, this was the truth for them, that somehow or another, the oppression of apartheid drained out of their bodies onto the floor. And in the cinema where I was watching it. And I just thought, wow, that's, something I'd like to have a hand in that, somewhere along the line. And I did to Mo Molim, when she was part of the Labour government, suggest that would be suitable. And Archbishop Tutu went to the north of Ireland to do it. And he tried, but he couldn't, well, he didn't come from the north of Ireland. It needed somebody from there who could rise up and lead into this terribly difficult situation. The peace process had a wonderful role to play in all that. But of course, on the ground level, you've still got a lot of bitterness right to this day. And that's why at the commemoration, people were finally talking about truth and reconciliation, because, the wall's still there in Belfast.
Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about empowerment. How do we get people to be empowered to find truth and to find, well, to be empowered to find truth and with compassion?
Well, I think we have to talk about it a lot, and we have to make sure that when we're talking about it, it doesn't sound distant.
Yes.
It's something that people feel it's tangible, it's just obtainable by them. And I think that is possible. One, by examples I've just given of people who've done it. But I think in each case, what I've discovered, this is purely empirical, through experience of all this, is the way in which, let's take the Lawrence family as an example, that they have gone to other situations. They went to the north of Ireland and spoke to the Bloody Sunday families, because the Bloody Sunday inquiry came after the Lawrence inquiry. And then the families in the north of Ireland went across to Yorkshire to speak to the Hillsborough families. And so there's this chain, if you like, a network of support that I think people, once they get in a room and they see that a whole load of people talking the same language, and I think over, well, I've been at it, as I said, 50 years odd. I think the things that intrigued me over that time is things have changed. When I first started, not in a shoebox, but when I first started, the idea of campaigning, the idea of families getting together, unheard of. There was a deference to authority. There was a deference to the court system, you know, that they knew what they were doing and you were just a little pawn, as it were, or cog in the wheel, really. That's changed, and I think people have suddenly realized they have a voice, they can use it, and they can make a difference, even though, you know, they're up against it. Probably when they are up against it, that's when it matters most. And if they can get support from other... So I'm not sure how far it answers the question, because, you know, you don't... hopefully you don't have to have a disaster before you get people together. You just hope that there will be a form of community. And I think that's one of the things that the global village does at one and the same time. It creates it but destroys it. Is that you can live in your tower block and really not know anybody. On the other hand, you can live in a tower block where there is a community, like Grenfell, where they all knew each other. So it's, and I'm not anti-political, but I have to say that the political class over the last 20 years have not exactly done us proud.
You mentioned you don't have to have a disaster, but I can name you two that unite us all. The COVID pandemic, which we're still in, and of course the climate emergency. So are they two disasters that should be really uniting us as a planet?
I think it should be. Yeah, you're right, it should be. And I think in large measure it does. People are interested and sympathetic to the exigencies of life facing everybody wherever they are, because they can identify, so you're right. They can identify with that. But I think, here's the interesting one, well, I think it's interesting, is, you know, here we are going on about vaccines. That's, you know, all right, it's not a remedy, but it helps reduce the risks and so on. However, you know, here we are talking about the fourth booster or something, I don't know where we're up to, well, second booster. Yet there are parts of the world that haven't even had one. So if we're talking about a global village, we have a global responsibility. And therefore, we should be saying to our government, thank you very much that, you know, you're accumulating vaccines for us through the universities and all the rest of it who developed them. But actually, how about sending some, which is what the World Health Organization is saying, come on, you know, the developed world, if that's the word for it, have got to look at the undeveloped world, because, you know, what they were saying at one time, you know, about the pandemic, if it's anywhere, it's everywhere. So if any part of the world doesn't get vaccinated, that comes back to us in the end, literally comes back to us. So it seems to me one has to be encouraged to think beyond the limits of the screen that you're watching, although it's telling you what's happened, you've got to yourself translate that into some form of action. And I think people do. They give generously, when they have the chance to do it, they do.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about vaccine nationalism. I suppose we talk about nationalism not just in terms of vaccines, but globally. I mean, we are all part of this one planet, and yes, you're right, each country should be, that if it has the resources, sharing them with the rest of the world. We can't think about borders. We can't think about, with global emergencies, and I've just named sort of two, you can't think about walls and borders and nationalities, can you?
No. Well, I mean, I don't, we don't think about it like that, but the problem is a lot of people do. I mean, if you like, there are political movements within the United Kingdom, within the United States of America, and a lot of other places in the world as well. And there we have a face-to-face situation in which people are protecting, and it's about nationalism, it's about territory. And so here we are, back in sort of gunboat diplomacy situations, which the English government also indulges in. If there's an immigrant coming across, send the gunboats out. We'll have the Royal Navy intercept, So we still don't have the global mentality. And we do at a certain level. I think a lot of ordinary people do think like that. But it's very rare to get the political level to start thinking. And of course, that was the idea originally behind the League of Nations and then the United Nations, was to think globally. But what's happened? You've got a divided United Nations, because the Security Council that has the power, if you like, to implement change is eternally divided between 5 major nations who tend to disagree with each other. So one side always uses the veto. Meanwhile, underneath that, you've got the General Assembly, where you've got the rest of the world discussing regularly serious problems, passing resolution after resolution for change, but nothing happens because the Security Council is warped, in my view, and until it gets changed, we're not going to make too much progress there. We were involved in the People's Tribunal on COVID, where ordinary people were coming together and saying, we're not going to wait for the government to do anything, because they're not going to. There's too much they've got to cover up, which is now being uncovered, some of it anyway. And I don't know, you were counsel, I don't know, how did you, was that your first one?
Yes, it was.
And what do you think?
My first People's Inquiry. It was, well, it was different from being in court, because plainly, well, firstly, it was all on screen. Secondly, different rules of evidence, because there weren't any, no accountability in terms of powers to bring witnesses. But fascinating, because the commitment of people who wanted to have their voices heard, whether they were experts or effectively victims, so COVID bereaved families, or medics, people working on the front line, the NHS, they all wanted to really to put a line in the sand to say, this is what's happening right now. We want this recorded. We want to give evidence to a panel so that it's available to people, so that it created a snapshot in time for what, and it can't be undone. It can't be unsaid. And there's a lot of power, I think, in those words and in what was recorded. And of course, we still haven't had our judicial public inquiry. But I would hope that it would be a resource. But I found it was really humbling, just the level of detail and the commitment of people to come together and say what they said, really fearlessly, I thought.
I think it's a good example of democracy in the true sense, not the sense that we've got it in the House of Commons. But at ground level, people exercising with a great deal of support, because one has to remember that wasn't funded by the government. Yeah. In fact, most of us, you and me for that matter, because I was chair of it, we weren't paid to do it. We did it because we believed it should be ventilated in this way. And I think it not only provided if you like, an annal of history so we can go back and look at it. I think for me, the real importance of that, which is not happening in any other model, is to say to government and to the authorities, we don't want to wait another 10 years while you work out what went wrong and how it went wrong. We want this to be done now, because the pandemic's going to go on as it has done. Because I think the whole thing that we were involved in was set up within about a year. So from November 2020 through to June 21, so actually it's far less, were the hearings, and then the report was December 21. So it's about a year to do the whole thing. That's not entirely unknown, but it's exceptional, because the people who were behind it all wanted government and the medical authorities, those in charge of the NHS and all the rest of it, Public Health England, we wanted them to know now, at the point that things were going wrong, what was going wrong and why it was going wrong, so you could do something about it. Because the problem with judicial public inquiries, wherever they're held in the world, is they necessarily and inevitably take a long time. From the moment you start to say you want one until the end can be 5 or 6 years or longer. And the problem with that is, you can easily see, by the time they're making the recommendations, people have fallen asleep. So, and other things have happened.
Well, memories fade, and sometimes history can be rewritten in the meantime, can't it? Because people don't remember everything, and then sometimes people will pick the bits of history out that they want to support their cause. So so with the People's COVID Inquiry, that it's there. All of the documents are online, all of the videos are online, the report is available to everybody, that it can't be undone, it's there now. And I think that's...
And in case anybody wants to find it, it's called Misconduct in Public Office.
peoplescovidinquiry.com.
Yeah.
Yes, so that was... I was sort of humbled by the way in which people engaged with that process. It was amazing, actually.
Yeah, because it was a range of people, wasn't it? I mean, it was, as you've mentioned, there were well-known experts like Sir David King, and many others who appear on all the news programs from time to time, independent sage people, as well as experts from abroad. So you had that raft of those. Altogether, I think we had something like 45 witnesses.
Yeah, something like that.
And if you add on all the ones that were read as well. So it's quite a lot. And also we had bereaved coming. We had people on the front line, NHS workers, people on the front line, working on the trains, underground, transport workers, and so on, who really have been through it. And I think it's easy to forget, we banged saucepans for the NHS staff. Well, that's one thing. And then we pay them, 1% extra. But, there's that frontline staff. And then you've got a whole raft of people, actually, emergency services, shopkeepers, workers, when you think about it, anybody who's got contact with the public had to do it at a stage where there was no protection, and billions was misspent on materials that can't be used, PPE. But why? Because they weren't prepared. Why weren't they prepared? I mean, pandemics are not, something that are brand new. Pandemics go back to the 5th century. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through them all. I know people get worried. Oh, he's off on one.
But I was about to say, I mean, the definition of key worker has completely changed from 2 years ago, hasn't it? I mean, the people who make up the fabric of society that helps us all continue to live and eat and travel to work if necessary, are really the really important people in society. And it's not the politicians, it's not the CEOs, it's the people who every day get up and make society work and function.
I mean, the key worker, now, it's interesting because I don't think I ever really thought about life as a delivery driver. A delivery driver is now an important part of our lives because we couldn't go necessarily out to shop, although maybe people have got back into that. But the delivery driver is an extremely important role. It's not just any old bod. And of course, when there was the petrol difficulty as well, it was deliveries of fuel. So I think pandemic has forcibly provided us all with an opportunity to rethink, reevaluate, reappraise what we've been doing. I mean, I know I have. So one thing, for example, I've had no desire to fly anywhere ever again. I really don't. I mean, and I was saying before the pandemic, why do we need, 15 flights to Amsterdam every day? For goodness sake. Because, when there was an airstrike, and you could see the sky for the first time. So I think it's that kind of thing that we can all make a contribution. We have a collective responsibility, even if the bit that we contribute is not a very big footprint. But actually, when you weigh it up, you look at all the other things we do. So, I've been moaning on for years about plastic bags. Well, okay. Now, at last, somebody's realised, paper bags would do better.
But that's the point, isn't it?
All our aspects of life.
Exactly. And that's the point that you make. So you've decided not to fly anymore. And not because you don't want to go abroad, but because of the carbon footprint.
Yeah.
And it's the mentality of, well, I've decided I'm not going to do this because this is my personal responsibility, and I feel that I have a desire and an obligation to do my bit to safeguard the planet. A lot of people would think, well, it's only, I'm only one person. That doesn't matter. But of course, if everybody thinks like that, then we've got a real problem, haven't we?
I mean, it's an economic argument because they're not going to survive, they being the providers, if we don't demand it. Mm-hmm. And of course, the problem has been, it's trying to get us all back to doing the things we were doing. Free flights to, all these special offers. I mean, I'm plagued. I don't know about you anyway, but every time I turn on my dinky iPad, up come all these ads, The bit I don't like is where they start talking about care homes and funeral directors. But you're getting all this stuff coming through because they're desperate to get you back into the marketplace, really without thinking about whether these are activities that we really globally should be thinking about how we redo things. And if you think about it, it's back into the smaller communities where we support each other, which we can do, at a local level. And it's going back into a situation in which we connect locally rather than, a bit of space tourism, which is coming in at the moment.
There are good reasons for space tourism, though, aren't there? Or is it all terrible?
Well, give me some.
Well, it enables us to look at the planet as a whole, doesn't it? So while it's completely, it's ridiculously expensive now, I mean, mobile phones were ridiculously expensive to begin with, computers were, but as things get cheaper, one would hope that it would get cheap enough so that people can experience the planet from above.
I know what you're thinking.
You do. It's about the Earthrise movement.
The Earthrise movement and the American woman astronaut, what's her name? Scott?
Scott, yes, but I can't remember her first name.
I'm completely fascinated by what she had to say on a radio interview. Maybe it was television, I don't know.
It was Radio 4.
Radio 4, all right. And I thought she was describing the experience, and she came up with a phrase, and I thought, yeah. She said, looking back down and seeing the planet Earth, which of course was like a pea in a pot. It's tiny compared to everything else, obviously minuscule compared to the parallel universes in which we all live. So, but she said, I felt like I was, or should be, a crew member on the planet Earth. In other words, I am a trustee, if you like. I am somebody looking after. And it rang a bell with me because of another woman called Polly Higgins, who was a barrister, who was very active in promoting the idea that we all should think of the Earth and the planet as our clients. And she was extremely anxious to ensure that we have a sort of a movement, and she set it up to begin with, to make systematic environmental degradation a crime, ecocide. And interestingly, it was going to be the fifth crime. There are four at the moment. It was going to be the fifth one in the late 1990s. But certain superpowers stepped in because, of course, they were worried that it would affect their industrial base and all the rest of it. And I think the UK, in its usual fashion, perfidious as it is, abstained on this major issue. So it didn't become the fifth crime, but there's a movement now, and it sort of popped up in COP26 as well. So there's recognition now on a much bigger scale that this is it's only part of the package of stuff. But it was Polly Higgins saying, you know, Michael, look at the planet, look at the earth you stand on. You represent that. And I'd always thought of a client being, you know, like you, somebody sitting in the chair. And once I started to think about it, I thought, why shouldn't I represent it? And therefore, you know, be involved in a movement which ensures its integrity. And I think it's the sort of Iroquois, was it? No, not the Iroquois particular. Well, yes, it was the Iroquois, who were thinking in North America, First Nation. They always had a habit of thinking 5 generations ahead. And if you start thinking about 5 generations ahead, you have to think about what's it going to be like for them. And they also, I don't think it was the Iroquois particularly, but First Nations had this connection with the planet. And this was another interview where the person being interviewed was saying that we regard the place where we live. We don't have names in the way that you do. We call a spot where we've been, we name it after ourselves. So there might be Lorna Tree or Lorna Square or Lorna Street. So it's all marked with your own experiences. And that's their connection, is we live here. This is what we are responsible for. So we're going to stick your name on that bit of back. And I thought that's another very interesting way, or an event that's happened. You know, maybe you got married there or whatever. So it's Marriage Corner. I mean, I know it sounds a bit strange, but it forges your own personal connection with that bit of ground, and the fact that that bit of ground is part of the planet, and that planet is part of a universe that we're trying to explore, and all the rest of it. I know what you say about the space tourism.
Well, I was going to say, and you can laugh at me if you like, but if you go into a public loo and it says, please leave the loo as you found it, well, perhaps we should all be thinking like that in terms of our time on the earth. I'd just like to take a moment now to mention our amazing sponsors, Clio. As I'm the head of legal practice at a law firm, I'm always looking for ways to become more efficient, to save time on administrative tasks, and to keep track of client contact and matter management. And I have to say, Clio allows me to do all of this and so much more. At Hackett & Dabbs, we've been using Clio for about the last 18 months, and it has been absolutely brilliant. Importantly, it allows me to free up my valuable time to devote more to my clients and to the matters that I am so passionate about, like social justice. Clio offers really great customer service, flexible contracts, and a free trial so you can try out their software before you buy. There are also really nice people who are totally committed to achieving access to justice for all in society, including the most vulnerable. In short, I would recommend Clio to any lawyer or law firm. To see for yourself why I'm so pleased with them, visit www.clio.com/UK/2heads. That's www.clio.com/UK/2heads. And now, back to the show.
Yes, I always think, where do you think I found it? You know, I found it here, so I'm leaving it. Yes, yes, being serious for a minute, just for a minute. Yeah, no, it's a great point. Yeah, got to. Well, of course, some of us are rather old. I can't remember what it was like when I first came into it, as it were. But it always, each generation is going to be very different. Yes. And one of the key factors is population growth. And I think that we perhaps don't pay quite enough attention because it's a sensitive topic. Because do you want to start managing numbers?
I'm not sure about there being a limit on numbers, but I think in terms of living sustainably, that there's a sort of tipping point, isn't there? Because I think for example, if everybody eats meat and we have a continuous population growth, then we're going to run out of food. And also it's going to destroy the planet in the meantime. But there should be, I don't know what that number is, but if 51% of people started living sustainably, whatever sustainability means, then that's the tipping point, isn't it?
Yes, that is the tipping point. The question is, nobody can fix it. Well, there are ways of fixing it in another sense, but I think what you're getting at over the meat issue, which I know we both feel fairly strongly about, namely that the way in which agriculture, not just here, but in the States and elsewhere, you've got these mega farms, otherwise known as factory farms, that are also known as intensive or industrial farming. Thousands of broiler chickens all in one shed.
Sometimes millions.
Yeah, there's one unit I know in the United Kingdom, 1.7 million. It's almost inconceivable to walk into, our shed's bigger than this, where we're sitting, and they're all on top of each other. They can't move. They've got to be fed. In fact, they're not going to live very long anyway, because they're all going to end up on shelves in the supermarket. And it's that in order to do that, the repercussions are, the methane gas, climate change, and also, obviously, to feed them, where do you get the feed from? Mm-hmm. You rip down forests in South America and import food which could feed people rather than, I'm not saying that the broilers shouldn't be fed. I think we're saying they're not fed humanely, and it's not a fair way, it's not a humane way of dealing with animals at all. It's entirely cruel. So that's one thing. And so I think we're saying that and now, well, they weren't saying it 10 years ago, even major organizations, the RSPCA and all the rest of it, are coming together and say, we've got to cut down on this protein intake. And if you can't do anything else, you've got to cut down on meat intake because of all the repercussions that it's having on our daily lives. So I think that's one thing. The other thought I had as he spoke was, I remember thinking, well, yes, if you can't limit numbers, because you don't know what it is anyway, and I know the Chinese tried to do it, other nations have tried to do it, limit it to 2, and then, the sons are preserved and girls aren't, and all that kind of thing. So you don't want to get into that, at least I don't think so. You don't want to get into eugenics and all the rest of it. I suppose another way of looking at it is it possible to devise food that is not meat-based, but that can provide sustenance for unlimited numbers? Mm-hmm. So, in fact, you have to worry less about the numbers than you do about how you're going to deal with whatever number you've got. And is there a way of doing it? Is there ways of living, of occupying the planet? For example, living under the sea, which was, in fact, contemplated at one. You build cities, because actually the globe is covered with more water than land. Mm-hmm. So, I don't know whether it's time to have some rather more interesting thoughts about how we might live and accommodate the numbers we've got.
Well, of course, the other thing is in certain parts of the world and the Western world, the population is going down, exponentially so. And so people are having fewer children. And so it's not going up everywhere, I think. But similarly, in terms of eating sustainably, which is, I think, because, of course, everyone has to eat, everyone has to breathe, everyone has to have somewhere that they can lay their head in the evening. Is it going underwater the right thing? Is going to the moon the right thing? Is going to Mars the right thing?
Well, this probably touches on another topic, doesn't it? This is what I think of as lateral thinking. In other words, another author from the 1970s, Mr. De Bono, who has almost been forgotten, but not entirely, according to one government department which employed him a few years ago, is that you can become straitjacketed into a situation. In other words, you're born into it, and you either go up or down. So it's vertical. And you're so used to it, it becomes, and I apply it to myself, you become like a straitjacket. And I wore a straitjacket. I know I did. I'm not blaming anybody. That's the way it was. Post-war. Don't ask me which war. It was post-war. And it wasn't until I got to a university where they had a particularly liberated curriculum, and that was Keele University in North Staffordshire. Unique at the time. And it completely opened my mind. And we had a whole year, first year. They said, forget what you came here to do. If you thought you were going to study history, whatever, which I was actually, they said, put it to one side, have a look at this. And you had a shop window on the world. And I remember sitting there feeling, I'm just fresh out of Finchley in North London. What are you talking about? So the first lecture was astronomy. So I learned about the universe, 1 week, astronomy, every day. And you sit there completely mesmerized, at least I was. It was like going to the planetarium. And I thought, yeah, wait a minute, I haven't thought about any of this. And then they went on to biology, and it ended up with zoology, needless to say. It was an A to Z of everything. And that was my de Bono moment, in which I thought, wait a minute, I've got something in here that's wanting to get out. And I changed what I wanted to do entirely. I didn't do what I went up to do.
So you went up to do history?
Yeah, history and English, I think, or politics.
So I'm interested in, so how many other people do you think, having done the A to Z of courses during that time, actually changed their minds?
Very interesting, because they did it for a purpose. At the end of that year, they asked everybody, what do you now want to do? I said, well, I certainly don't want to do all the ones I came up to do. Thank you very much. I've had enough of that. And so I did philosophy. I hadn't even heard of the word. I really hadn't. We didn't do it at school. It wasn't a subject. And I thought philosophy sounds fantastically, interesting. Don't understand any of it. I thought something I don't understand, I think that's the one I want to do. I don't understand it. And what else did I do? Economics. I did biology. Had to do 2 main subjects and 2 subsidiaries, so you're doing 4 subjects, none of which I'd done before. So I thought, And I remember going to the first philosophy seminar with a very famous, well, he was, unfortunately he's dead now, Professor Flew, an empiricist. And I went in and he said, he was very forthright. I'm not saying anything behind his back, even though he's dead. He knows all this because I've told him since. And he ended up on a program I was doing called The Moral Maze. He was a witness on the program. And he looked at me just like you're looking at me, and he said, so why are you here then? Have you read any philosophy? I said, no. Have you not even, and he came up with Wittgenstein, Hume and Locke and all these other. I said, no, sorry, other than your lecture, which I thought was completely fascinating. He wasn't bothered how I thought of his lecture. He said, then you don't deserve to be here. Go away and read something. And when you've read something, I'll see you back here. Jesus, I thought, if it's going to be like this, maybe I've bitten off more than I can chew. Anyway, I went back and I did some reading, and I went back, about a month later, and in trepidation as to what he was going to do. Anyway, I'll cut the long story short. I mean, he just, I went for it. And at the end of the whole 4 years I did there, I did the exams and all the rest of it, and I got an upper second. I'm not boasting about it, but it's an interesting aspect. He came up to me before I left and he said, I want to tell you one thing. He said, you got a first in philosophy. He said, but you couldn't get a first overall because your other results weren't very good, or they weren't as good as that. And I said, well, actually, thank you, because I thank you. You forced me to discipline my thinking, and to not only discipline, you need to sit down and do it, but also to broaden it out and think about other things that, like living under the sea. Mm-hmm. You know, there are other ways of doing things. I don't like the analogy about there are many ways to skin a cat. I don't like that one. But, you know, it is about doing things in a multitude of... There's an infinite variety of ways of approaching a problem. But if you always approach it this way, going to get stuck. Whereas if you employ... You've got all these tools up here you can use and say, well, wait a minute. Why are we thinking of that? Why don't we think about this? And I often get mad at presenters on television who never ask the tangential question, you know. So why are you doing, you know, they don't ask the why question, if you like. And maybe the ability to do it's gone. But it was that course that I say to people, if only you could do that. You can do it. I didn't think I could do it. Well, I hoped I could, but in the end of the day, it was blood, sweat and tears that got me there, and an individual who led the way. So it was amusing because he came onto the moral maze, and I said to the producer of the program, I want to cross-examine him first. And so it was very funny. And I let him out of the building, and he said, and I said to him, I loved the opportunity. And he said, yeah, he'd just converted. He became a Christian at the end of his life. I mean, he was the most, he didn't adopt that at the start. And I just thought to him, I said, how have you got to this position of believing in God? You know, I don't quite follow this. You know, we were on an escalator at the time going down. So I think he just sort of said, I think that's enough for one day. So he sort of left the building, and then he died not very long after. And I was very, very sad about it because he made a major contribution to philosophy as a whole. And he certainly made a major contribution to my life and changed it dramatically. There's always a teacher. Who was it who said that? Nobody I want to remember. There's always a teacher in your life.
That is very true. My son is my current teacher. So,
what did he say so recently, son?
Well, I was going to say, I think that is probably the subject for the next episode. What do you think?
Yes.
Great.